I'm glad you could join me today for lesson number 4 in Unit 7. For quite some time now, we have been discussing Charles Darwin's concept of natural selection. Today, we will take a closer look at this process as I delve into pages 424 to 431 in the Campbell Biology in Focus textbook. Let's get started. You may, on occasion, hear someone criticize the theory of evolution by saying something like this: "Well, I don't see how a random process such as natural selection could result in something as complex as the human eye or the brain, or all of those delicate biochemical pathways in the Calvin cycle." And of course, they're correct. A random chance process could never produce such astonishing complexity. But it's important to realize that natural selection is not random. It's not a chance event. Mutations, the mistakes in the DNA that introduce new genes, that create new alleles, those may be random. But natural selection is not a random process at all. When individuals survive and reproduce and pass their genes down to the next generation, that's not a random process. It's nature sifting through all of the genes available in the gene pool and only selecting those alleles that provide the greatest fitness, the greatest chance of survival and reproduction. Only those genes are getting passed down. So it's not a chance event. It's not a random event at all. And I think that's a misconception that a lot of people have about how natural selection works. Now, I mentioned the term fitness a moment ago. And it's important that you realize that in the context of evolution, fitness has a very different meaning than you would typically think of. When we talk about fitness in the evolutionary sense, it does not refer to how strong or fast or agile an organism is, but rather fitness refers to an individual organism's ability to contribute genes into the next generation. Therefore, relative fitness would be the contribution that an individual makes to the gene pool of the next generation relative to the contributions of other individuals. And so evolution is really about who has the greater fitness. Within a population, which individuals are contributing the most genes into the next generation. For example, a predator who is faster, more agile than the other predators, that faster, more agile one is going to catch more prey and therefore probably survive longer, reproduce more, and pass its genes to the next generation. But a predator that's slower or more clumsy is going to be less likely to pass its genes on. So the fast, agile predator would have greater relative fitness. If we're talking about a prey species, if the prey is faster, more agile, better at escaping, then it's more likely to have greater fitness, right? Because it's going to survive longer, reproduce more, pass down its genes. But again, fitness doesn't have to refer to anything having to do with speed or agility or strength. Even a barnacle, the tiny, crusty little immobile animals that attach to the bottom of boats and piers and things like that, those tiny barnacles, if one barnacle is more efficient at collecting food from the surrounding water than its neighbors, then that little barnacle will have greater stores of energy, will probably live longer, and most likely will produce more eggs and therefore reproduce more successfully. So that barnacle has greater fitness. If a moth has a body color that allows it to conceal its location from predators, allows it to blend in with the tree bark that it's resting upon, then that moth is going to be more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce. Obviously, a moth that gets eaten by a blue jay is no longer able to reproduce, right? So the moth that blends in and has better color for blending is going to have greater fitness. So fitness has to do with how successful an organism is at passing its genes to the next generation. Okay, as I said before, our main focus today is going to be to learn more about how natural selection works. And so one of the things we haven't talked about before is that natural selection does not always affect a population exactly the same way. There are different ways natural selection can shape the gene pool. In fact, we call these the 3 different modes of selection. So the first one is called directional selection, which is going to shift the average phenotype in one direction. You have the second one is called disruptive selection, where the intermediate phenotypes, sort of what you might think of as the average phenotype, gets selected against. And so the sort of oddball phenotypes get selected for. They get favored by natural selection. So that sounds kind of weird, but it'll make sense when you see the examples. And then there's stabilizing selection, where the relative proportion of average middle-of-the-road phenotypes continues to go up, and the relative proportion of fringe oddball phenotypes gets less and less. So all of these, I think, will make more sense when you see some examples. So here we go. So let's talk about directional selection first. Notice we're going to start in our hypothetical example here with a population of mice, like field mice. These would not be like the kind that live in your house, but more of a outdoorsy variety of field mice. And notice that there's a fairly wide variety in phenotypes as far as fur color. So some of the mice are almost white. Some are sort of a tannish color. That's sort of the average. Notice most of them are that middle tan color. And then a relatively low percentage are really, really, really dark, almost black. So that's probably pretty typical of many different species of rodents that you would have this kind of variety. You get a bell curve where the majority of the mice are sort of intermediate in terms of their color. Well, directional selection would be any time natural selection shifts this average phenotype either to more of a darker color, or it could be the other way, it could be more of a lighter color. So the example that your textbook uses is, suppose this mouse population moves into a new environment where there's a lot of volcanic soil. Volcanic soil tends to be very, very black, very, very dark, and whereas other soils are more grayish brown, tan colors. So if this population moves into a new area where the soil is really, really dark, obviously these few mice that just happen to be kind of unusually dark, they're all of a sudden going to have an advantage. And the majority of the mice that are kind of tan or even light tan, they're going to be real easily spotted by predators, and they're going to get gobbled up, and they're not going to reproduce very successfully because they're going to be eaten. And it's going to be the darker mice that are going to be surviving longer, reproducing more. And so it's pretty easy to predict what's going to happen. This average color is going to shift to the darker phenotype. It probably wouldn't take very long, just a few generations, before you would have a noticeably darker population of mice. So that's shifting in one direction. This is kind of the easiest one of the three to understand, I think. It's called directional selection. And I included a couple other examples. I want to give you a little more detail about these. So let's talk about the Peter and Rosemary Grant study that was done in the 1970s. Now, this was out on the Galapagos Islands, the very same islands that Charles Darwin had visited in the 1800s. About 100 years later, this couple, Peter and Rosemary Grant, both biologists, went back to the Galapagos and they wanted to see if they could measure. They wanted to see, can we actually measure noticeable changes due to natural selection? And so what they did is they focused on one particular species of Galapagos finch, and you see a picture of the little bird right here. It's one of the seed crackers. So notice it has a fairly thick beak, and it cracks seeds all day long. That's what they eat. So what they did is they used some kind of humane traps or nets that they would capture these birds. They would measure with a little instrument how thick their beaks were, and then they would put a little tag on them and record their data and release the birds back into the wild. So no birds were harmed in the collection of this data. And this was in 1976, or actually they did it for 3 years and concluded in 1976. And over that course, out of hundreds and hundreds and maybe even thousands of birds, they calculated the average thickness, top to bottom, of these beaks. And it was somewhere around 8.9 millimeters. That was kind of the baseline. They left. They came back to the island about 2 years later in 1978, and they sampled the birds again. And this time, the average bird beak thickness for this species had dramatically increased from an average of 8.9 all the way up to about 9.7. And it didn't take them long to figure out why. So in the intervening year, the year that they were not there collecting samples, 1977, there was a dramatic drought in the Galapagos. These are kind of semi-tropical islands. They usually get a lot of rain, but there was a very pronounced long drought that lasted all summer, very little rain. And what that does, it causes the plants to produce larger and thicker seeds that are much harder to crack, because the seeds need to have an extra thick seed coat to avoid drying out in the midst of a drought. So literally the food supply became harder for these birds to access. And so what was happening was the finches that had thinner than average beaks, like delicate beaks, couldn't crack enough seeds to stay alive. So they were dying out. And it was only the finches that had like the thickest of the thick beaks that could survive during that drought year, because they were the only ones that could crack the seeds. They got enough to eat. They survived and they reproduced. And so all of their offspring tended to have thicker beaks. And so this happened quickly. I mean, this was just in 1 year, basically. It was this one intervening year in between their data collection. And it was a very pronounced shift of the phenotype, which was beak thickness, in one direction, from sort of moderately thick to really thick. So that's directional selection. Another really famous example of directional selection. This one's in all the high school biology textbooks. You can't hardly take a biology class without talking about the peppered moths of England. So this is a species of moth that lives in England and probably other parts of Europe. And they're all, you see two of them in this picture. You notice that some of these moths have white wings and white bodies with little black speckles. And then some of them are just black, like the body and the wings, or you can barely see it right here. See this, what I'm pointing at? So that's a black peppered moth. And so they're the same species. They just happen to come in two different color varieties, kind of like yellow labs and chocolate labs. The same species, just two different color varieties. Well, anyway, in the early 1800s, almost the entire population was white. The white speckled peppered moth, that's where they got their name, because it looks like somebody sprinkled pepper on a white moth. And it was extremely rare to find a melanic or black moth. They did exist, but it was a really low allele frequency. And the reason for that is obvious, because moths are active at night. During the day, they rest on the sides of trees, and you can see the light-colored tree bark. The black moth is going to be really easy to spot. Every bird that flies by is going to be like, ooh, that looks like a juicy meal. And the black moths just don't live very long because they get eaten by birds. But the white moths can blend in very easily to the bark, and birds don't see them. Well, something very interesting started to happen in the mid-1800s in London, England, and many other cities in Europe and around the world. The Industrial Revolution began, and people started building factories and burning lots and lots and lots of coal, which produces pretty thick, nasty smoke. And so all of the beautiful trees around London began to darken. The bark got black over just a few years from all the soot. And so all of a sudden, these rare black moths that never really had much of a chance to survive, now, even though they're small in numbers, they've got a huge advantage, because now they blend in. And those white moths, which were very, 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 very common, all of a sudden they're the ones getting eaten. And the black moths are surviving and reproducing. And so here's the data that you can see. They've collected data, sampled the population over quite a period of years, and very predictably, the percentage of black moths went way up. And so by about about 1940-ish, almost the whole population was black. So that's directional selection. It's shifted in one direction. Now, directional selection can reverse, because what started to happen in the mid-1900s is people started to get pretty serious about cleaning up the environment. All these hippies in the 1960s started, saying, hey, we're destroying our planet here, folks. And, they started passing legislation, Clean Air Act, and all this stuff. And so no longer is just unfiltered coal smoke being spewed out into the atmosphere. And so as the level of pollution decreased, gradually the black color faded from the trees and the buildings and the rocks. And so slowly the white moths have started to become more common, and this is showing the black moths becoming less common. Again, this was directional selection moving towards black, and then since the 1960s, directional selection moving back towards white. Pretty cool examples of directional selection. Here's another graph. This one's kind of cool because it overlays the level of smoke pollution around London. In the 1960s, it was still pretty high because they just started passing the legislation. And then you can see the level of smoke started to gradually go down, down, down over about 20 years until the air became relatively clean in the 1980s. And predictably, but slightly afterwards, you start to see this slow decline in the percentage of black moths until nowadays they're almost, it's very rare to see a black moth. It's sort of shifted back to how it was originally. Great examples of directional selection. Now we come to disruptive selection. So if we start with our original population, where the average phenotype is most common, and then you have just the really light-colored mice are rare, and the really dark-colored mice are rare. Disruptive selection would be if something happens where natural selection starts to basically kill off the intermediate ones, the ones that were the most common, start being selected against, so their numbers get less, and the proportion at both extremes starts to increase. And you think, gosh, how the heck could that happen? It's hard to imagine how that could happen. But in this hypothetical example, it kind of makes sense. Suppose this mouse population moves into a new habitat, but this time, instead of being volcanic black soil, suppose it's a very patchy habitat where you have lots of areas where there's light rocks and very light colored soil, but then there's other areas where you have patches of really dark soil, and then that's it. There's nothing in between. Well, these few mice that are really dark, they're going to be okay because they're going to be able to find places where they can kind of hunker down on the dark soil and not be seen. And the ones that are sort of freakishly white, they're going to be okay because they can sort of blend in on the really light colored soil. But all of those mice, the ones that are most numerous, which are the kind of in-between brown ones, they can't blend in on the black soil or the white soil. So they have nowhere to hide. And so over several generations, even though there's a large number of them, that number is going to start to decrease. But the white mice are surviving, so their numbers are going to go up. And the darker ones are surviving, so their numbers are going to go up. So that's kind of a hypothetical example. But a real example that really illustrates this very well is a species of finch, this time not found on the Galapagos, but on the continent of Africa. There's a species of finch called the black-bellied seed cracker, and the name kind of tells the story. All the members of this species have seed-cracking beaks, so they're relatively thick, but there's two very distinct phenotypes that you see. In this particular species, you'll either see a relatively small seed cracker beak or a mega extra thick, like heavy duty seed cracker beak, and there's almost no in between. Like the numbers of in between beak thicknesses are almost zero. This dip goes way down. So you're seeing birds at two different extremes. You're seeing the small seed cracking beak or the really thick seed cracking beak without much in between. Now the reason is the small beaked birds are very well adapted, and they really have a good, easy time with soft seeds. And they have a precision with their beak morphology that allows them to manipulate the soft seeds and kind of pull them out of their shells and eat them. The large beak birds obviously are specialized for cracking really hard seeds. And what seems to be happening is that any finch that's intermediate, that's just sort of in between, and there probably are some of those around, but they're not particularly good at cracking either type of seed. Like they have a hard time with the soft seeds because they can't pull it out of the shell, and they have a hard time cracking the hard seeds. And so they really just don't get enough to eat, and so they don't live long enough to reproduce, and so they have lower fitness. Remember, fitness doesn't have anything to do with how good a shape you're in. It's, are you able to survive? Do you have what it takes to survive and reproduce and pass your genes down? So if you have a small beak, yes, you do have fitness because you can pull the little soft seeds out of the shells. If you have really extra thick beak, you can crack those hard seeds and get enough to eat. But if you're in between, you have low fitness because you're not particularly good at either type of seed. This is called disruptive selection. The middle just drops almost to nothing. All right, and finally you have what's called stabilizing selection. This is where natural selection works against both of the extremes. So remember, in a typical population, it's going to be a bell curve. And so on the extremes, the numbers are already pretty low. Like in this case, the numbers of white mice would be like almost zero, and the really light colored mice would be very low. And likewise, the dark mice would be really low. And so most of them, the high number is always going to start out at least with being the intermediate. Well, with stabilizing selection, that trend continues and intensifies. So the extremes, in this case, the really light and the really dark, just those numbers get even less and less and less and less over time. Whereas only the average middle of the road phenotypes are really surviving well. And so their numbers just continue to peak even more. They're already peaked, and then they peak even more with stabilizing selection. So let's go through a few examples of how this could happen. So first, our hypothetical mouse population. Just imagine if, once again, these mice, this whole population moves into a new environment where all of the soil, maybe it's sort of a desert habitat where all of the soil is just kind of one color, and it's not dark soil, it's not light soil, it's just sort of in between tan colored soil. Well, if you're one of these poor, rare black mice, you don't have a prayer, because you can't hide anywhere. There's no soil dark enough for you to blend in. Likewise, if you're a white mouse or really, really light mouse, you don't have a prayer, because you're way too light to blend in with that tan-colored soil. So in that case, the only mice that are going to live very long are the ones that are intermediate. They're not dark or light, they're just in between. They're the only ones with the right color to blend in with the soil, so they survive, they reproduce, their numbers increase in the gene pool, or in the population, and those poor black mice just drop off to even lower numbers, and the white mice drop off almost to non-existent as well, and so that is stabilizing selection. Now, a really obvious sort of human, real-world example of this is if you look at data. Now, you'll find exceptions to this rule, but if you look at the human population as a whole, or if you pretty easily Google like U.S. data on this, average birth weight for humans ranges from 6.6 pounds to 8.8 pounds. And it's relatively a low percentage of births that fall outside of that range. Now, there certainly are cases where, like a preemie, for example, is going to be below 6.6 pounds, but I would assume this is only for full-term births, because obviously if you include preemies, that's going to skew the data. So for full-term 9-month births, this is kind of the range, and it's pretty unusual for a baby's birth weight to be outside of that range. It does happen, but the reason is when babies are born with a birth weight that is much smaller than 6.6 pounds, they don't have as much stored energy, they don't have as much stored body fat, and so that makes it difficult for their brain and organs to develop, and so they have a increased infant mortality. They're less likely to survive. Now, obviously, there are plenty of preemies that are born 1 pound, 2 pounds, and with really intense medical therapy and super duper nutrition, a lot of them do survive. But statistically speaking, worldwide, a lot of these babies are born in places where you don't have modern technology. So if you're born with a birth weight that's 5 pounds, 4 pounds, 3 pounds, statistically you're not going to survive nearly as often as babies that are born within this range. On the other hand, and this is especially true in like third world countries where they don't have modern medicine, if a baby is born above this range, 9 pounds, 10 pounds, chances are that baby's going to have a hard time fitting through the birth canal. So it's probably going to be stillborn, or it's going to be really, really high risk for not surviving childbirth. And so, that's what stabilizing selection does. It favors the medium. It favors the middle of the road. It favors the average phenotype. Another one that's kind of interesting, especially when you look at photographs, we all know that giraffes have much longer necks, not only necks, but also legs. Their limbs are much longer than typical mammals, obviously. And, there's a lot of speculation about how maybe natural selection favored the longer necks and the longer legs because it allowed giraffes to exploit food resources that other mammals could not exploit, right? If you had intense competition for vegetation, finding enough food, all these mammals grazing in Africa, if they all graze at ground level, there's not going to be enough food for everybody to eat. So it could be that natural selection favored the longer neck morphology because it allowed giraffes to exploit vegetation high off the ground that other mammals couldn't get to. So if that's what happened, then of course that would be directional selection. And it begs the question, over time, if we track giraffes today over the course of, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, if we look at multiple generations of giraffes in the African savanna, are the necks and the legs still getting longer, 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 longer? And the answer to that is no, because of stabilizing selection. So yes, there is an evolutionary push where natural selection is favoring long necks because it allows them to get more food. But there's also selective pressure against longer necks because of this. If you've ever been to a zoo, or maybe you've been fortunate enough to go on an African safari, I have not, I would love to do it someday, but if you've ever seen giraffes drinking, it is pretty awkward. Like, they have to splay their legs out and crouch down in this really awkward position just to get a drink of water. If giraffes evolved even longer necks, and especially longer legs, this would be even more difficult and more awkward and would make them really vulnerable to predators that are often lurking near water holes like this. So it's natural selection pushing from two directions, right? Natural selection is going to select against shorter than average giraffe necks and legs because those animals are not going to get as much to eat. But on the other hand, natural selection is also going to select against longer than average legs and necks because those animals are going to have difficulty drinking. They're going to be vulnerable to predators. So who's surviving? Like, who's got the fitness in the modern giraffe population? It's the middle of the road, right? Of course, even middle of the road, average giraffes have fairly long necks, let's face it. But they're probably not going to get any longer because of stabilizing selection. They seem to be right where they need to be for survival in the African savanna. Okay, so there's a pattern that kind of relates, I guess, to stabilizing selection, or it's kind of goes hand in hand with stabilizing selection, and it's something called heterozygote advantage. Sometimes it's also referred to as balancing selection, and this is where you have two different alleles that code for two different traits, okay, or two different characteristics, and yet natural selection simultaneously favors both of these alleles. The classic example of this is the allele for sickle cell. It's called the HBS, or sickled hemoglobin allele. And we've talked about this a little bit before. Back in our unit on heredity, we talked about how the sickle cell mutation, HBS mutation, is much more common in the African American population than it is, say, in the Caucasian population. And there's a very important evolutionary reason for that. So in the continent of Africa, and particularly equatorial Africa, right in the center of Africa where the rainforest is, right along the equator, malaria runs rampant. Malaria is caused by mosquitoes, which carry a plasmodium parasite. And people die of malaria at alarming rates in that part of the world, and even more so in the past. So here's how this relates to malaria. So in Africa, any human that is born with homozygous for HbA, that's normal hemoglobin, so both alleles code for normal hemoglobin, that person is going to have red blood cells that have the nice normal round shape. They flow through the capillaries just fine, no blood clots, no sickle cell anemia symptoms. But that person has no natural resistance to malaria. So if they get bitten by a mosquito, there's a really high probability they're going to catch malaria, and if they do, they're going to die. I mean, without modern medicine, some remote part of Africa, they're going to die. On the other hand, a person who's born homozygous for HBS, 2 copies of that recessive allele, their hemoglobin, all of it, is going to be abnormal. All of their red blood cells are going to take on this sickle shape. They're going to not flow through the capillaries very well. They're going to get stuck. There's going to be blood clots, very painful, enormous levels of fatigue, and eventually death. You know, this person's going to die of sickle cell anemia probably during childhood years before they ever get a chance to reproduce. So for many, 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 many generations, hundreds, maybe thousands of generations in equatorial Africa, guess who has been surviving? It's the heterozygous people. So if you're born with 1 copy of the HbA dominant allele and 1 copy of the HbS recessive allele, you're heterozygous. Some of your red blood cells will have the sickle shape, but most of them will still have the round normal shape. So yes, you might have very minor symptoms. You might have what we call sickle cell trait. You're not going to have sickle cell anemia, but you might have some minor symptoms. But hey, not enough to shorten your lifespan. And you are completely immune to, or almost completely immune to, the malaria parasite. The parasite cannot survive within your blood cells. So this person has an enormous level of fitness, right? Because they're not going to die of malaria, and they're not going to die of sickle cell anemia, so they're going to live a long life on average and be able to reproduce and pass their genes down. But the poor guy who's born HbA, he's going to die of malaria. Or the lady who's born with sickle cell anemia, she's going to die of that disease. So for many, 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 many generations, it was only the heterozygous folks in Africa that were surviving and reproducing. And so even in the African American population today, where malaria is obviously not an issue here, but the relative the frequency of that sickle mutation is higher in that population just because of their ancestry. So what's happening is natural selection is favoring the normal hemoglobin allele, so that, because it doesn't cause sickle cell anemia. At the same time, natural selection is also favoring the sickle cell allele because it prevents death by malaria. So natural selection is favoring both alleles at the same time, and so those allele frequencies are remaining fairly constant from one generation to the next. Now, we know, and we've talked about this in previous lessons, that natural selection produces organisms that are very well adapted for survival and reproduction within particular environments. But can natural selection produce perfect organisms? And the answer to that, of course, is a resounding no. And what I'm trying to do with these examples is just illustrate to you that there's a lot. Nature is chock full of examples of where natural selection, as wonderful of a process as it is, and it's such an effective process, but it does not produce perfection. it cannot produce perfection. So when we look at nature, we don't always see things that are the way we would have designed it. Like things don't always line up or work quite the way that an engineer would have designed it to work. So there's lots of examples of this. I put way too many in here, so I'm not going to bore you by going through every single one. I hope you'll take the time to read through them. You can pause the video. I'm just going to mention a few. So in mammals, the organ that produces eggs, unfertilized eggs after meiosis, of course, is the ovaries. And then the tubes that carry the egg down to the uterus, excuse me, are called oviducts or fallopian tubes. And there's a gap in between them. The tubes do not connect directly to the ovary. There's a very tiny gap in between. So occasionally, a fertilized egg will escape out of that tube and implant outside of the uterus. This is called an ectopic pregnancy, and it's always fatal for the baby and can very likely be fatal for the mother. That's not the way you would have designed it. If you were an engineer and you had the option to design the reproductive tract, you wouldn't design it this way. But that's what natural selection created. The recurrent laryngeal nerve is one of your cranial nerves. It runs from your brain down into your chest cavity. It loops underneath your aorta, which is the large artery coming out of the heart, and then goes back up to your throat area to your vocal cords, which is a really odd pathway. It's not a problem for us because it's a relatively short trip from the brain to the chest and back to the neck. But for giraffes, this is a ridiculously long pathway for this nerve. But that's what natural selection ended up with. Another one that's kind of fun to investigate is the design of vertebrate eyes, including the human eyeball, which is just an exquisitely complex, beautiful organ, the way it works and all of the delicate parts. But it has a flaw. It has a flaw. It has a design characteristic that is not the way an engineer would design it. And that is that the optic nerve and several of the key blood vessels that feed nutrients to the retina are on the surface, the surface of the retina where the light strikes when you look at an object, instead of being sort of mounted behind the retina. And because you have this place on the surface of your retina where the optic nerve connects, and there's no light sensing cells on the tip of that optic nerve, it creates a very tiny blind spot in your visual field. And you might be thinking, I ain't got no blind spot. What's nothing wrong with my vision? What are you talking about? Yes, you do have a blind spot, and I can prove it. So right now, if you just kind of relax your mind, focus on the image, the plus and the dot that you see on your screen. And what you want to do is you want to look straight at the image, just kind of normal distance away from your screen. And you want to look, I had to read the directions. So you want to close your left eye, or maybe better yet, cover your left eye, and focus your right eye on the plus. Okay. Now, even when you do that, you can still see the dot out of your peripheral vision, but don't look at the dot. Look at the plus, and then slowly, very slowly, move your face towards your screen. And at some point, and you may have to play around with it, at some point that dot's going to disappear. Okay, and you can do it the opposite way. If you cover your right eye and stare at the dot and then move closer, the plus sign will disappear. Anyway, so that's your blind spot, and everybody has one because there is this imperfection in the design, quote unquote, of our retina. So why is that? Why does natural selection not fashion after hundreds of millions of years. Why can't natural selection make perfect organisms without these flaws? There's four basic reasons, and we're going to go through them quickly. So the first reason is that natural selection can act only on existing variations. Natural selection can only work with the characteristics, the traits, the genes that are already in the gene pool. Natural selection can't just start from scratch the way an inventor might do. Evolution is a tinkerer. It tinkers with what's already there and tweaks it to suit a new environment or a changing environment. But natural selection can only favor the fittest phenotypes among those phenotypes that are already present in the gene pool. Reason number two why natural selection cannot result in perfection: evolution is limited by historical constraints. So, for example, birds at some point, obviously, in their evolutionary past, evolved wings. So did bats. But if you look at the bones that make up the bird wing or the bat wing, we've talked about these bones before: humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Hey, those bones already existed. You know, every amphibian, reptile, dinosaur on Earth had those bones. So natural selection can't just design a wing from scratch. Natural selection, as we talked about before, tinkers with something that already exists, that basic bone structure, and modifies it, tinkers with it, adapts it for a new use. Evolution does not scrap, does not get rid of the ancestral anatomy in order to build a new complex structure from scratch. Evolution can only modify structures that already exist. Reason number three why natural selection cannot produce perfect organisms: adaptations are often compromises. So if evolution shapes a body part to make it better at doing one job, it's probably going to make it harder to do some other job. And so, it's hard to be perfect because organisms have to survive in a variety of conditions. So a great example of this, I don't think anybody would argue that seals who do spend a good bit of time on rocks, they would be able to move better on those rocks if they had regular legs instead of flippers. But if natural selection had produced seals with legs, then they wouldn't be able to swim as well. And I doubt seriously that seals with legs would be able to survive very well in their aquatic environment. They wouldn't be able to find enough food. They wouldn't be able to escape predators. So it was a compromise. No, flippers are not ideal for the rocks, but they do improve survival in the ocean. Humans and all primates have prehensile hands, hands that can grasp really effectively, and very flexible ball and socket shoulders, very flexible hinge joints in our elbows and knees, much more flexible than other mammals. That's one of the hallmark characteristics of primates. And it serves us well, especially primates that are still surviving in the treetops, swinging from tree limb to tree limb. They need those extremely flexible arms and legs, and they need to be able to grasp those tree limbs. But having a skeleton like that makes us much more prone to sprains and torn ligaments and dislocations. If you play sports, if you're around athletes, you know somebody who has blown out an ACL or an MCL or both. We got bukus of them right here at Union Pines. So you don't see that very often in other mammals. I'm not saying you won't ever see a dog with a torn ACL, but it's pretty unusual. Our evolutionary compromise is, yes, we have this tremendously flexible, dexterous skeleton, but it's prone to injuries that other mammals don't have to worry about. And then the number 4 reason why natural selection does not result in perfection is because when evolution occurs, chance, natural selection, and the environment all interact to shape animals and plants, to shape living organisms. So for example, a storm may blow insects and birds many miles from a mainland to a distant island. Those insects and birds that get stranded out there on that island, they're probably not going to be the ones that were best suited for island survival, right? I mean, because this isn't natural selection. This is just random chance. Which birds were in the wrong place at the wrong time and they got swooped up by the wind. Those were the ones that landed on the island. And so it's just chance. And so natural selection is going to, help them survive. Either that or they'll go extinct on this new island habitat. But natural selection can only work with the genes that are present in those birds that just happen to get blown over to the island. That part of it is chance. The environment at a particular location is constantly changing. Some environments change from year to year. And so adaptations that were useful and helpful a year ago, those same adaptations might all of a sudden become liabilities. Sort of kind of like with the peppered moths. For many, many thousands of generations, the white peppered moths had an advantage. And then humans come along and start making all this smoke, changing all the trees to black. And so all of a sudden, last year's adaptation is no longer a good one. The light color is now bad, and the dark color becomes good pretty quickly because of that changing environment. So for these 4 reasons, and probably others, natural selection cannot and will not ever produce perfect organisms. It does produce well-adapted organisms, but if you look close enough, you'll see the flaws. And I hope you'll take the time to really look at this list, and then you can find lots of other good examples if you search on the web for evolutionary imperfections. You'll find more of these. These are all pretty interesting. Before I leave you today, from time to time, I like to throw out an extra credit opportunity. So this week, the first 10 to email me with the answer to this question will receive some extra credit. And the question is, the human retinal blind spot was used in this lesson as an example of what? Look forward to seeing your email. Take care and have a great day.